And welcome to the Future for Business Owners Expansion, Degrowth, or Deglobalization. As a business owner, you may be wondering about the future. Will my industry continue to grow? Will I need to expand into new markets, or is this the time to go in a different direction? Welcome, everybody. My name is Chris Templeton, and I'm your host for today's presentation. I want to thank you for being here and introduce our panelists today. First up, Sergio van Luijk, Managing Director of Cap Expand Partners. Sergio draws on a remarkable range of experience helping businesses and investors achieve mutually beneficial goals. His experience is in international private equity and institutional investment, and this gives Sergio a seasoned appreciation of investors' objectives. Sergio, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, and thanks for that summary, Chris. Much appreciated.
Anything you want to add to that before we move on to our next panelist?
Glad to be here.
Perfect. Hey, our next panelist is Joost Folkers, who's a hospitality development specialist. He focuses on being a homegrown Dutch guy, but raised and worked as a globetrotter across. I think you're now in your 17th country, aren't you, Joost?
Yeah, it's like roulette.
Joost focuses on hotel operations and is a strategist in five-star hotels over the last 20 years, and he's currently in Doha, Qatar, pre-opening a Waldorf Astoria property. And separately, he co-owns a financial project consulting firm on various non-hospitality development projects. Welcome, Joost. Anything else you want to add?
Chris, it's so good to see you and Sergio again, and also our special guest today. Thanks again. Excited about today.
Me too. Well, let's talk and introduce our special guest, Anirvan Sen, who is the CEO and founder of Fifth Chrome. Anirvan Sen is an experienced leadership and strategy consultant with over 25 years of senior management experience across Europe, APAC, South Asia, Middle East, and Africa, and the US with some of the world's largest companies, including General Electric, Stryker, Akzo Nobel, Coca-Cola, and Manpower Group. Has a strong track record of leading, mentoring, and advising senior business leaders with growth, mergers, and acquisitions, M&A. Welcome, Anirvan. How are you? And thank you for being our special guest today.
Thank you for making me participate, and I look forward to a wonderful discussion. And as we were talking about it earlier, this topic is also very, very close to both personally as well as professionally. And I'm kind of, as I heard Joost's introduction, I'm kind of the reverse. I traveled around the world before I settled down in Netherlands. So it's the reverse of Joost. I look forward to the conversation.
Welcome to all of you, and to our audience. Thank you so much for being here. We're really pleased to have you, and we hope that this is going to be enlightening for you. There are some terms that are new to me, degrowth and deglobalization, but I have a good idea of what they are, and we're going to give everybody an even better understanding of why we should be talking about these, especially as it relates to expansion. They seem to be opposite, and perhaps they are, but let's get started with Sergio. Talk about what degrowth is and why we should be talking about that right now.
Degrowth is a concept which is not new. The actual definition of degrowth is different from what a lot of people think. A lot of people associate degrowth with no growth, or in fact, stepping backwards. But the idea is really as follows, Chris. The term gross domestic product that we all know and stems from basically the output of production and consumption in a country is really a concept that exists since the 1930s. And obviously we've seen quite a lot of growth since then, and now in 2022. And the question really is, when you look at that curve, how sustainable is that in our current environment? And by environment, I mean not only economically, but more from a sustainability perspective, in terms of ESG considerations. Is growth really the way forward? Based on capitalist, capitalism basically states that you should invest and keep on growing. The concept of degrowth somewhat defies that and contests that, and basically argues that there should be some sort of stability when speaking of growth as a business or economy.
And so when you think about that, is stability the antithesis of growth? Because it doesn't seem like it would be to me. I almost feel like what you're saying is what we're trying to do is to moderate stability and growth and create some kind of a balance.
I think that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it, Chris, is stability, not so much, but should we be growing year after year? Is the concept of growth, particularly given the last 100 years, is that sustainable, right? Is that what is necessary for us as a society at large, right? And what starts happening when you keep on growing in terms of environmental impact, water scarcity, pollution, holes in the ozone layer, et cetera, et cetera. Is this a metric that we should really be keeping a check on, and we should really be using as a leading or a key parameter?
And so is kind of the answer in terms of degrowth, is it a question of then looking at moderating my growth in order, as a company, in order to kind of take into account all the things that are going on around us?
I think that's a fair way of putting it. It's finding that balance and not being fixated on the concept of perpetual growth, and focusing on and taking into account also different measures that take into considerations some of the aspects that I just mentioned. And so basically, the pure believers in degrowth are really defying the conventional wisdom as far as capitalism is concerned, whereby you keep on investing everything that you earn and keep on growing and growing and growing, because they question the fact that whether this is something that is sustainable in terms of looking at other parts of society or the economy at large. We were taught at school that there is scarcity in the market. Economics is all about limits and scarcity. Why are we focusing so much on continuous growth when we look at other aspects of our society at large, whereby there are limits, and it's not necessary to keep on growing, but instead to find a balance?
And I think one of the things that you would agree with, Anirvan, is that this is not, if you're not a purist of degrowth, you still see the value of a capitalist economy, and there being some balance there in terms of just not being straight growth. Is that right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And just time check. I just want to make sure we're streaming live, because LinkedIn Live is not on. It's still waiting for broadcast. So Sergio, if you could just have a look at that. if it's on LinkedIn Live yet, because I don't see that. So, I'm just taking a pause for 5 seconds.
Thank you.
Yeah, I am getting a live feed.
You are? Okay, good.
I'm getting
So-
a live feed, but sometimes it might just on the blackout. But yeah, it's good that you mentioned that.
Right. So to your question about degrowth, Chris. So essentially, the way I look at it is, growth is required for the welfare of the society. That's how human beings we evolve, right? However, growth also creates certain norms and phenomena in the society, i.e., capitalism, and along with any of these economic phenomena, there is a social phenomena that is attached to it as well. So what happens is, in the pursuit of growth, quite often, whether it's nation state economies or companies, that they want to have growth at any cost, as the common phrase goes. But what that means is, it could mean that certain parts of the society may be left behind, or certain parts of the world may be left behind in the way growth is happening. On the other side, certain sections of society may be left behind, which is why we now have a strong conversation around inclusion and diversity. There's a reason for that, why that is happening. So at times, companies, and since we're talking about companies here, businesses here, at times companies would need to defocus. And when I said not defocus, I shouldn't say, because defocus means you should not be focused on growth, but should look at items that could cause degrowth. It should look at items that have an impact. And Sergio talked about ESG. I wanted to include diversity and inclusion, D&I. I want to talk about equal participation, equal opportunities. We should look at the 17 goals of UN that are trying to create a meaningful impact. And as we all know, there are lots of businesses who are doing lip service, and there are lots of other businesses which say that they want to impact the are one of the 17, but they're not in a position to. So in other words, degrowth for me is a necessity. Like we pay taxes, like we have to comply with regulations, companies should also look at degrowth as an opportunity to do a catch up, rather than looking it at as a constraint or a hurdle to grow.
And from that standpoint, then, really what I hear at pretty strongly is that what we're talking about in this panel, in terms of our definition of degrowth, is that what we're looking at is how to be a business that's healthier in all aspects other than just straight growth. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. And I would just add, because I come from an M&A background, and I've also worked with several private equities. What I often see is, in the urge to grow, especially the startup scale up and then become a unicorn, quite often some of the fundamentals, especially when it comes to organizational and operational resilience, developing those right levels of governance, that gets missed out, because it's the endless pursuit of growth at any cost. And it's getting exemplified. I would say the last 2 years, the pandemic, it has given us a chance, an opportunity for us to take a stock, look at what's wrong in the way we have done things, or what could be improved upon. And that's, I would say, sum up to your question. I think it is a fair statement to make at this stage.
Joost, what do you think about this degrowth
Yeah.
concept?
I think, yeah, definitely coming from the hospitality field, I mean, everybody's trying to come out of it. It's hit everybody hard the last 2 years. But in the hospitality field, in the travel field, it's very clear that in one point, deglobalization was just an abrupt stop. It was not even a choice. It was just very, very clear. It's just pulling on the handbrake. So we had no mighty power of it. So I think nations on their own, especially when it comes in terms of working in a people's industry based on people's emotions and empathy and people is everything. It's not so administrative overall. I think business owners, they had to look back into their nation on what are the plus sides of degrowth. And I think amongst ourselves, I'm sure we could feel that there are certain factors, or as Anirvan rightfully said, so there's certain items we have to consider where degrowth is useful. But beyond that, on hospitality in the travel field, because hospitality is dependent on travel, but then again, travel creates other businesses and other industries, which, for example, let's say expos and all that, and people at expos, they fly in, so, and then they stay in hotels and etc. So, it is a catalyst for other businesses, right? But to give that example, a point of degrowth was you would have, let's say, a range of restaurant brands, and they would have no more visitors, and they would not be able to expand. They could not do any more brands outside. So their reset button was, okay, let's work on what they call basically on catering services, deliveries, home cooked meals. And a lot of these restaurant brands, they just stepped away from, well, first of all, they couldn't even expand anymore. They couldn't focus on the globalized approach anymore. So to use the winning side of degrowth, let's look at our nation and let's see how we can use our same assets and look at our personnel and our skill set of personnel, not so much on what they have to the CV, and see if we can broaden it out. And especially in Southeast Asia, where what I've experienced there is that these countries that are so dependent on meals and the service and delivery, they get that at home, and they started breaking bank right in the middle of the pandemic. So it's not that now that we're coming out of it, they will forget that. Let's go back to where we are. They're actually using that now and using that system, even let's say into hotels, and even airlines started collaborating with restaurant groups, etc. So there is a total focus on what we've learned during our degrowth and how can we apply it and fight that inflation risk still, and fight that unemployment matters, which was a risk for everybody. So I feel that there's definitely opportunity nation to nation. And on the secondary note is a lot of local, let's say, businesses or nation brands, they were dependent in their way that they had to accept that degrowth. For them, it was degrowth, but now for them, there's an opportunity to partner up with international brands and either become a partner or a franchise or taken over. So they themselves, they have to focus on this degrowth. However, they're going to make this fruitful terms and conditions, let's say, with top brands. So I think it's been a healthy reset in that sense, at least in the recent 6 months as we are coming out of it.
I'll throw this open to any of the panelists. Forced degrowth, as I think we can call it, really has had some benefits, hasn't it? And looking at, I think it's forced us to all look at our businesses in ways that we hadn't ever thought about. And yet I think your point, Joost, is, gee, there's some real advantages. What are some of the other advantages that you folks see in terms of forced degrowth and how it's going to impact us as we move forward? Because we're not going to forget these things, are we?
Okay,
Yeah, I'll take it maybe first, and then
Anirvan, go ahead. Yeah.
So kind of combining degrowth, deglobalization, and expansion. In my opinion, I think the train has already left the station for globalization. What we are likely to see is the two parallel tracks almost happen. One is the globalized world, so there is going to be supply chain that is going to be there, which would be largely globalized. At the same time, there would be nations and companies who would start looking deeper in building capabilities, right? So what deglobalization does not mean that will start making large scale investments in semiconductor industries or making television screens in let's say in Western Europe. That is likely still to continue in China or in Asia, right? But on the other side, how AI, how the new age, the digital age stuff is unraveling. Some of those innovations are going to happen a lot more in, let's say, in Europe or in North America. So it's not going backwards. It is essentially reinventing or unraveling, unlocking some of the human skills, some of the human intelligence augmented by digital advances, technology advances that have taken place. So that is definitely something that I see. Deglobalization does not mean we're going back in time. Deglobalization means we are going to develop our own capabilities in country or in a region alongside the global world that we live in.
Yeah, the term I actually prefer to use there is globalizing, and because I mean, obviously, the pendulum of should we outsource to the Far East our production, or should we manufacture locally? I mean, that's a pendulum that's been basically been going on for quite a while, but given the current and market circumstances coming out of the pandemic, obviously we've got the war in Ukraine that's triggered, and I think for a lot of businesses to say, okay, we've got supply chain issues, we need to keep our manufacturing and the source basically close to where we are in order to avoid any type of supply chain issues. So I think that's really what's been triggered and accelerated in the past couple of years.
We're jumping a little bit ahead, but let's move to deglobalization. And Joost, talk a little bit about, from your standpoint, what that means and why it's important.
I think I'm not going to go into anything when it comes to the political point and the political events, because I think it throws in a wrench of the idea of deglobalization, even though it has an effect, right? But if you look at where the world has come to and how it has to move forward, there's actually a term that's linked to it called globalization. And globalization is just what everybody was trying to anticipate as much as possible in the last year of to get to, instead of having a full stop. In the world of hospitality and travel, I feel that the deglobalization point, as I mentioned, was obviously unavoidable. But I also feel is that it became an opportunity for national brands to relook at how they could work on their own workforce, on their own staycation market, what new kind of rates they could drive, how this would help them on their local economies, and create more of a nationwide trading. As Anirvan pointed out, look at your own tech and data, your own manufacturing, this and that. And so I feel that this deglobalization has created a couple of plus points. I think also that I'll take the Middle East as an example, specifically from my own personal view. I think Saudi, Qatar, right, definitely scratching the surface. They're taking really this right approach to obviously focus on what they can do as a nation and create this curiosity for the external world, like, look what we're capable of. Yes, of course, there are certain funds that lie aside to it, but it's not for a short term. So they want the eternal growth to happen because of their nationals. So I think that's in the world again of where leisure and travel creates business, because we meet people, we engage with people, we find out what people are good at, and then you make a deal, you make partners, you set up a networking system. This deglobalization will not affect travel at all. I think it will actually enhance curiosity to do things within a nation. So.
And
may I, sorry to interrupt you, Chris. because I think it's interesting what you said in terms of, staying away from politics, but I think, it is nowadays almost inevitable to not talk about politics when you're talking about globalization and the economy. And, if there's one thing that I've noticed is that, the European Union has never been as harmonized as it has been in the past from an economic and political perspective. I think obviously with the UK after the Brexit, that they are not in an easy position at the moment. Obviously the US and Europe, they're both suffering from inflation, but due to different driving factors. On one hand, rising wages in the US and in Europe due to rising gas prices and oil prices. So I think it's difficult to really not talk about politics, given the impact and the influence that this has on our global economy.
But yeah, I get your point. I think that has a lot to do with the Western countries, with Europe and let's say United States. But if we look at, say, continents like South America, Africa, Middle East, we don't read as much as about politics. They're quietly, increasingly doing very, very well when it comes to coming out of it. So no, I get your point definitely that the politics is unavoidable. It has a total factor on the decision making of what has to happen within the country and deglobalization. I totally agree. But then again, the whole media can play another role, right? I mean, you don't hear anything, let's say, about Africa. I was just there 2 weeks ago. South Africa is the 5th fastest growing hospitality country in the world right now. You don't even hear about it, right? Because they quietly, they have some matters, but they keep trucking. So I think, yeah, it depends. I think also how loud does a country want to voice out what's going on in their country, right? Or do you want to be a country that's a bit more silent and you do have your issues, but you don't voice it out and you manage your own issues, right?
Yes, but I mean, for me, that's part of the whole deglobalization phenomenon that we're really referring to, is that every nation, given the current geopolitical circumstances, is really focusing on their own nation and their own country, and as a result, from a political perspective, really trying to look after their own businesses and their own customers first in their own countries before really looking abroad. And so, to your point, look at the position that China is taking at the moment in the in the current geopolitical circumstances. I mean, they're sitting on the fence, as are some other countries. As the fence gets higher, it's going to be more difficult to stay seated on the fence, right?
You mean the fence gets sharper?
The fence gets sharper, yeah. And this is actually a very interesting topic, because so typically what happens is, and that's my view. So sometimes the governments need to step in, because literally, especially when the crisis, financial crisis, whether it's 97, 98, or in the late 2000s, when real financial crisis hit, governments have to step in. But governments continuously meddling in because of populism creates a barrier for businesses to grow, and I can cite some examples where some of the Chinese apps got banned in India, or let's say the whole thing about 5G and Huawei in the Western world, the arrest of the daughter of Huawei in China. And again, I'm not saying that there is no truth behind the allegations, but it's also driven politically. It's got a real strong political let's say angle to it, and that's why the deglobalization to a large extent is a government spoil play, in my opinion, rather than an enabling, letting
Mm.
companies, foster in a true globalized world. Because under the protectionist measure, any company can grow as long as they can get that favoritism. And
Yeah,
yeah,
and that's exactly what I agree with. It's that noise. How popular does a country want to voice out, and do they truly really mean it, right? Is their voice truly focused on it, or is it just more because they want to stand out in the classroom?
yeah, and that's why I think as we come out of the pandemic, my view is, as I said, that we're going to have some parallel tracks. 2 years, it's given a lot of times for the companies to think, and also in the next few months, we should start seeing light at the end of the tunnel from the Russia-Ukraine crisis, which is there. Um, what my worry is, a lot of the companies and a lot of the nations would go back to their, let's call it the 20th century thinking, that I need everybody in the office, or that the best way for companies to grow is through national protectionism. And that worries me. So while I do say that sometimes you need people in the office, sometimes you need to have the diversity of ideas, and that's why the diversity and inclusion is important. But there is also a chance that it may just become a lip service, and especially under political and economic pressures, companies may just end up doing that.
And maybe even worse, and I run to your point, I share your concern, is that international trade, treaties, all of these types of arrangement between countries, all the things that we've been taught that lifts up the wealth of the economy on a global scale, that's basically being curtailed at the moment. And and that's something that worries me as a business owner. Should you really now be looking across the border, given the current circumstances, combined with what you mentioned about the pandemic effects, or is this now an opportunity? And I think a lot of business owners are really concerned about about international expansion at the moment.
It seems to me that one of the things that we really do need to focus on is what the opportunities are. What are the things that we can learn from the last couple of years, and recognize that deglobalization, period, I'm not going to be global, obviously isn't an answer, as Anirvan has pointed out, but that there is some value. What are some of the things that you guys think businesses should be seeing as opportunities as a result of going through the pandemic and some of these concepts gaining some traction?
Yeah, I'll go first again. So I think there will be a few things that I would like. I wouldn't say it's going to happen, but I would like to see happen. Right. The first thing is that because these 2 years have given us an opportunity to reflect upon how the world is going, and it's not going to be the last time that we see an uncertain situation like this. It's probably going to be played out a good few times going into the future, right? It also showed how vulnerable today's jobs are, right? So, till before the pandemic, if you ask somebody, hey, can your job be moved to another part of the world? The emphatic answer would be no in most of the cases, right? And then pandemic hit and everybody worked from home, which is a remote place. You could be based anywhere. You could be based in Qatar, in Philippines, in Bali, wherever, still do the job, right? As we come out and as we get into this, right, what is going to be extremely important is that the nations and the companies start looking at that we cannot rest on our past past achievements. We have to start thinking about our education, about our the way we create jobs, and make it more entrepreneurial. You know, and again, because I come from the East, but I've been living in the West more than half of my life, I can see the compare and contrast. And what I see here is there is a certain amount of inertia amongst the workforce in the West. A lot of it gets taken for granted. A lot of it is, oh, the government is going to take care of me. Okay, especially in the socialistic countries in Western Europe, we see that more often. But what that means now is that pandemic has shown us that, hey, you know, your job potentially could largely be done by somebody else who's sitting in another part of the world. So until and unless we start developing new skills, we start infusing new ways of education in the society, in the system, in the countries, we are going to get these questions come to us with more noise. It's going to be louder than before. So nations need to relook at how you're going to skill our people going into the future. Okay, so that would be one very important thing. The other thing would be that balance, as I mentioned about, you know, how do you live in the globalized, or I think the Sergio nicely called it, de-globally globalized society that we live in. So that's going to be there. The world is going to become a lot more equal ground or equal level playing field until and unless spoiled by nations with their populist measure. We have to embrace for those measures, as in whether it's a war declared, whether it's protectionism declared, and it is going to happen more often than ever before. You know, so I think you talked about the European Union, that a lot of members countries are coming in together, but we, you know, not many years back, we had Grexit or potential Grexit with Greece. We already see some discontent in Eastern Europe before the pandemic. So we have to embrace ourselves that the governments are likely to spend or step in more often. So these are few things that we need to relook at, preparing as a business, as a company, for these uncertainties, what to do and how to still take care of the global advantages that are there. So yeah, I'll wrap it up there and let the others.
I agree, Anirvan, and it's you know, it's not, and it does tie in at the end of the day to the whole degrowth concept. Not that I'm you know, a advocate of degrowth, but you know, the point here being that, you know, the old kind of fashioned thinking of, you know, population growth, that is what's going to drive the economy. You know, it's about, you know, technological advantages, competitive advantages, and developing these in other areas. And I think on top of that, you know, when you talk about hybrid models, working from home, et cetera, you know, a distinction needs to be made between, obviously, you know, the service industry and the manufacturing industry, or, you know, or other old school economy types of industries, whereby, you know, obviously in the West you see you know, partly driven by factors that you mentioned before, AI and technology, that we are moving and shifting more towards a service-based economy. So it's, you know, it's also embracing that and learning how to cope with that, and re-educating and upskilling people in order to be able to cope with these differences in order to remain competitive.
It seems to me like one of the things in regards to the pandemic, also in regards to degrowth, is what we're seeing with people saying, you know what, I'm not going to work for low wages anymore. I'm going to do something that I want to do, that has meaning to me, that I enjoy doing, and I'm going to do it from wherever I want. It's it's a pretty big change. And one of the things that you mentioned, Anirvan, is in regards to how do we help our workforce grow? How do we give them skills? What's it going to look like for companies and employees over the next 5 to 10 years with all of these different changes happening?
If you can just take on it when it comes to people's take on their skill set. I spent about 2 weeks ago on an intense trip, looking for seeking talent in a particular project. And you go in with normally with the same thing, that you look at their resumes, you look at what they've done and all that. And I can tell you, and I've seen about, I think 300 to 400 folks. And I can tell you that right off the bat, I had to switch my mind once again to look at what they've accomplished in the last year or two, which was not normally in their field. Look at their persona. Understand how passionate what they were doing and how good they are on what they were doing in the last 2 years. I think we've all read the stories online about how pilots became delivery boys, things like that, how moms who used to work at a bank started up their own sustainability soap business and flourished nationwide. So, and this is purely on focusing on your survival, on personal passions. And I think I truly feel that people nowadays, and especially business owners, when they're looking at recruiting, they have to look back at, why am I bringing this person? Is this person motivational, passionate about being part of this? That's management of inclusion, or I'm just going to bring that in because back in the day, you had to have a certain degree or certain accreditations, and you must have done so many years. That formula, I don't think is going to work anymore. And if we want to go from degrowth or one day back to growth, we still need to apply the same.
It seems to me that that's really one of the big drivers in terms of this idea of degrowth, is that, you know, not only are employees changing how they want to work, but as employers, we need to be open to and figure out how to address those issues with employees in a way that everybody is served. But at some level, I think that's one of the drivers of degrowth, and that I have to pay my people more. I have to do things for my people that I may not have had to do in the past. Am I on the right track?
I would actually oppose that part of it, Chris. And so if you look at historically, and this is pre-industrial revolution, right? And this is where you needed to know your own craft, right? So you were a craftsperson, or you were a farmer, or you're a butcher. You know, you had certain craft which you either acquired from your ancestors, or you were an apprentice with a master where you learned the craft, right? What industrial revolution did was it started creating these massive assets, right? And then you had businesses, railroads businesses, or manufacturing businesses, where they started getting scale by employing machinery, you know, so augment human ability with machines. What that led to was they had to systemize the whole thing, and it created a workforce that was the blue collar workforce, right? So these are the people who'd work on the shop floor, and it created a layer of managers. Okay, that thinking has still is still going on. In other words, when it comes to employee training, we always seem to say leadership and employees. When it comes to employee training, it almost feels like as if the leaders need to take care of the employees. And nothing wrong in that. That worked back then when you had larger companies, who had made investments. But as we go into the digital world, as we evolve, what I would see is that mindset needs to change. It is no longer the responsibility necessarily of the employees to upskill you. It is for the employees themselves, who should be looking out for themselves and how do they upskill themselves. And that is going to be a differentiator, which is why, you know, whether it's gig economy, whether it's because the existing management shackles that exist in businesses are too let's say they're too rigid to be broken very quickly. I mean, typically in corporate world, you're likely to send to a classroom training once every 2 to 3 years. Okay, and that's seen as a perk, that you're being sent for a classroom training somewhere rather than anything else. And on the other side, you know, companies have recognized the need to skill, so they've gone into this mass consumption or mass open source education, where they say everybody needs to attend these video courses or watch these video courses on AI. Where companies are failing to take advantage of it is, how do you empower and enable those employees? Because I may watch 100 hours of video on AI, but that still does not make me skilled in AI. Okay, and this is where the mindset needs to change. Like when we were getting educated, sometimes we would also take it to ourselves to learn more. When we would do research, that we would learn more through our means, that thing needs to come back to the real world, and especially in the degrowth and the deglobalization scenario.
Which is
Sergio?
I mean,
Joe?
listen to what Anirvan just said and digesting it, I think, I agree, and in part, look, at the end of the day, it has to be a top-down decision, and I operate in the mid-market. And when I talk to certain business owners, we've all seen the trend towards tech in the past couple of years. Not every business owner in the mid-market is really aware or being alerted, or kind of, there's no alarm bells kind of ringing in terms of, I should be doing something with my workforce. Everything that I've done in the past, and the way I've done things in the past, I'm going to continue doing it. So kind of embracing this whole kind of new technology era, I think is something that, particularly in the private mid-market segment, which comprises, at the end of the day, quite a large part of the economy, I think is lagging. And this not only has to do with employees, but it has to do with the entire value chain, with supply chain. So are you applying it in your production facilities or in your logistical facilities or network, and that's something, that's a realization. I think that it's difficult to judge to what extent it is, I think, necessary post-pandemic, but at the end of the day, let's face it, there's also been quite a hype as far as tech has been concerned, and in the last couple of years. And the question still remains, I think, yes, tech is important. I think the pandemic has accelerated the requirement to evolve. And at the end of the day, sorry, I was just getting in a question from someone. I think at the end of the day, we need to be realistic to see in terms of what kind of hybrid model is applicable and will work going forward, and depending on whether you're operating in the service industry, depending on whether you're operating in the manufacturing industry. I mean, what we're seeing now is a slow down in demand, as a result of which manufacturers are, in fact, they are speeding up their supply chain, but there's less consumer demand. So there's some slowdown, and what you're seeing is an increase in inventories, and then have to manage that. So we're living in an era where you have to be very agile, and particularly as a mid-sized company, to adjust to changing circumstances. And I think that's really difficult.
I forgot to mention one more point, if you allow me. We are also looking at at something which is inevitable, right? Which is the generational divide, because literally what we find is a lot of the policies, a lot of the management paradigms that are there that companies use were invented or were polished by baby boomers. The next gen, which is most of us, have just followed through that. So we still use the management principles. On the other side, if you look at the millennials and Gen Z, they are oriented very differently. Right from early, the moment they can get their hands on smartphones, and let's say as young as 8 or 7, or even the iPads, the way they start thinking is very, very different from people like you and I. They will find new ways of doing things, and I think the technology evolution that has taken place is not necessarily can I do things faster, better, cheaper, or more efficiently. It's leading to sprouting of new type of companies, new operating models, the way we think, or we look at things, right? That is going to disrupt. It's already disrupting, and it is going to continue disrupting. And this is where I personally see that how many of the employees can sustain without acquiring not necessarily technology skills, but I call them future skills. What are the things that I need in order to remain successful or to have a successful career as an entrepreneur or as an employee in the future? And that decision needs to now sit fairly and squarely with the employee themselves.
We have to wrap up, and let's do it this way. Let's just talk about, from each of your perspectives, when you think about expansion, these concepts of deglobalization, degrowth, from each of your perspectives, what can we look forward to? What are the things that you think are the biggest takeaways that a business can look at these things and go, this is going to help me, as opposed to looking at this as a big problem? Joost, let's start with you.
I mean, thanks for asking, because I kind of had it in my head. I think just to wrap it up, deglobalization, especially from the field of travel and industry, we're very much dependent on travel to making it work, because people are getting tired of just being on the phone and not being able to connect face to face. Deglobalization is on the slow start, slowbalization. It is a must. It is a need. It is a desire right now. I think degrowth will happen more on let's say a regional scale, but I think also degrowth will soon be no longer on a national scale. And you see this parts of the world, let's say Southeast Asia, Middle East, or even Africa as a nation. And therefore, I think expansion as a business, again, is possible on a continent, and they're doing that already. So just working our way backwards from least feasible to feasible, I think that's what I'm seeing, what's happening right now in the travel market and the hospitality market, and it's very healthy, and we're sticking to that reset button.
Well put. Sergio?
Globalization, expansion, degrowth, deglobalization, they're all interconnected. We're facing unprecedented circumstances with a war that's going on, which is creating a certain amount of uncertainty in the market. Coming out of a pandemic that we haven't seen to this magnitude since the last 100 years. I think the whole kind of the way that every country is responding with Brexit, with the Nordic countries considering stepping into the NATO, with Turkey at the same time wanting to be part of the EU. I mean, this is the climate change. This is a very, very difficult balance to find. I think it is going to create pressure on prices and going forward, especially in the second half of this year and maybe continue into the 2023. So it is a fact of life, and I would not want to be responsible for any type of Fed or central bank role in terms of trying to stabilize the economy and the inflation at the moment, because it's extremely difficult.
Anirvan, our
Yeah,
special
so-
guest today. Let us
Yeah.
wrap with you.
Thank you. And it's always good to do the wrap up because then I can say things which others can't argue on. But for me, the future, the near future and the future is very exciting. And I've noted down a few points, right? It is going to be a lot more participative, okay? The future. So I'll start with first, we would see a lot more democratization of businesses across the globe. You know, it's no longer going to be, can I do business with China or not? And I'm just saying China. Can I do business with EU or not? Can I do business, more and more countries, nations are going to be part of that. So that's democratization of business, but also we'll see some of the white elephants die away and being disrupted by some of the new age agile, whether it's Ubers of this world or the new banks, insurance companies, you will definitely see that. The second thing is this whole degrowth, deglobalization is also, and the advances in technology, and in general, the awareness of human resources is leading to innovation. Innovation is on steroids right now, especially digital innovation. How you do things, the Fitbit, to measure your heart rates, or the way the electric bikes operate in, Amsterdam. Innovation is on steroids. It is only going to accelerate in the coming years. I would like to see a lot more inclusion, because inclusion means diversity of ideas, and that would lead to both innovation and democratization. To Sergio's point, as well as yours point, sustainability, a lot of us have become a lot more aware of what sustainable and ESG means. We are becoming a lot more aware as a lot than our previous generation did. So which is why we see sustainable. And I would end my thoughts on the topic on saying we also need to make sure that we are now embarking on new skills. New skills, whether to acquire, how to facilitate global vendors, how to manage uncertainties like the one that Sergio talked about, the supply chain, or how to be an independent freelancer. So we are going to look at a lot more new skills development taking place as a result of both the pandemic as well as deglobalization and degrowth. So that's my 5 cents.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Sergio van Luijk, Managing Director of CapExpand Partners, Joost Folkers, Hospitality Development Specialist, and our special guest, Anirvan Sen, CEO and founder of Fifth Chrome. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for your insights. To our audience, we always want your questions, and we will keep an eye on this presentation and any questions you have and make sure they get answered. Thank you, gentlemen. Thanks to our audience. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.